3, 1. Boom, we're live. We're on again. Another week of Evolution Hour. Thank you, Jackson Wheat, for helping out the old RJ navigate through the weird circumstances of circumstances here. As those of us who have been following me for the last 8,000 years will know, that I've been dealing with the Contested Bones book of Rupi and Sanford, a wonderful representative of just exactly why creationism has its head up its ass, because they're really bad at sourcing material. And I was asked to review this thing source by source from a source methods direction, and that's what I've been doing, which means looking through every claim they make and the sources they present to buttress them, and finding out whether or not that's what it's supposed to be or not. It's been really fun because I just hit Jackson today with a blip that I only discovered yesterday when dealing with the research, which is our dear pals managed to say at one point, thirdly, carbon samples not subject to internal contamination such as diamonds still reveal measurable levels of carbon-14, and no footnote. Oh, that's interesting. That's a really amazing claim to make. Why wouldn't they reference it? That's why I put the heading up for this show as the case of the missing footnote, because who would they reference for that except a creationist? And who would those creationists be referencing ultimately except Andrew Snelling? And who would Andrew Snelling be referencing except either the rate group, which is questionable, or the Taylor-Southon paper from 2007, which is misrepresented by Andrew Snelling? We're going to be covering that, as Jackson well knows, in chapter 2 of the new book. Shameless plug time. You might as well. The rocks were there. But I put a link into a 2007 video to show how this information is not exactly bursting new. There was a person who was criticizing young Earth creationists in 2007 when this original argument was being put out, and he was complaining about their misrepresentation of radiometric dating and radiocarbon dating and stuff, and he has a bunch of linkages and stuff up to that. So I put that linkage in there in the second part. And the really fun part is that one of the sources that guy made reference to happened to refer to the radiometric dating or contamination that can occur when uranium decays, and it can produce some carbon-14 in the chain of that. So there was a suspicion that some of the extraneous carbon-14 is actually being produced from uranium if it's in that kind of a deposit. Well, our little pals, Rupi and Sanford, bounce past that at 900 miles an hour because they cite a 1980 paper, which alas was not fully available, but a reference on this from this guy Zito, and says some have argued that new C14 may have been created by heavy radiation of biological samples by nearby uranium deposits. However, uranium deposits are not ubiquitous, and radiation could never be intense enough to create carbon-14 faster than it decays. And they then quotes geophysicist John Baumgardner, another young Earth creationist, who in a letter affirmed to Rupi and Snelling that the thing they wanted to be true was true. Well, golly gosh, there was that Bonetti paper from 1999. And in fact, there's a whole slew of technical work that's occurred since then, which is that they've been experimentally determining how carbon-14 is produced in uranium decay. And it matches exactly with the stuff they find in these things that are in areas where there's a lot of uranium. Radioactive stuff occurs in many spots. In fact, if you decided to live all of your life in Grand Central Station, it's not a good idea because there's a little remnant radioactivity from the stones that were quarried from the thing that were used to build the damn railroad station. So maybe they're not actually the best of on that. So all of that's in the part 2 link, and we'll be discussing much more interesting material which relates to the Cambrian explosion and that. But I wanted everybody to be on the table in relation to this carbon-14 thing. This whole long chapter, and it's one of the big chapters in Rupi's book, is an attempt to dismantle the radiometric dating issue, because they're screwed if things actually are as old as they appear to be. So they've got to scavenge all over the place. And one of the ones they scavenged yet again was in this 2015 paper on the dating of Homo naledi, and that they had done some additional preliminary things where they dated a bunch of stuff in a lot of different dating, including radioactive dating, carbon-14 dating. And lo and behold, it came up with a date of like 30 to 40,000 years, which was, they didn't say it was anomalous. They just said this was an indication of how contaminated this particular area is with stuff. And then they went off to the main issues with the other radiometric stuff. Well, Rupi and Sanford just want to dismiss it because, well, they're just automatically dismissing this as contamination. No, they're observing it because there's a whole bunch of things. Another paper, I think I put the link in on it, which is on that they had actually made the mistake of citing. Let's see, I think it's the, this is what happens. Yes, Nadeau. Carbonate 14C background, does it have multiple personalities? And I think I put the listing up on that because that one's available open access. That was in Radiocarbon from way back in 2001. But it was about our little old pals, the foraminifera, and how they were trying to figure out, can you radiocarbon date stuff that's fairly recent enough, but how can you weed out that contamination issue? So obviously what they would be looking at is stuff that's really, 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 really old and therefore shouldn't have any carbon-14, but if it does, why? And it turns out that even some things that were thought to be relatively free of contamination because they had relatively flat surfaces were turning out to actually have carbon-14 that gets seeps into the organism, variety of ways, even if it's fantastically old. So it was actually a wonderful little paper, which it would be nice if Rupi and Sanford had actually paid more attention to the content of. Well, there we go.
I mean, that kind of sums up their whole book, doesn't it? It'd be nice if they actually had paid attention to the data.
Yeah, and be honest with what their goddamn position is. Pardon my language, pardon my French. Is that if they want to defend a young Earth creationist frame, then jolly well do it. Tell us what you think happened, when it happened. If you think there's a global flood, okay. Are the samples we're looking at ones that were occurring before? Are Adamic creation that are dying out in the flood, or are they people that have been existing after the flood? Are these the children of Noah? Use your argument. Come up with it. Tell us the demographics. Offer the source citations to establish the biogeography of animals and human beings pre and post flood. Apply the model, except they don't have a model. They only have a cartoon. And they can never get past the cartoon. I was amazed, and I'm alluding to it in the upcoming chapter after the chapter I'm finishing up of yours, how Andrew Snelling, when he wants to show the pre-flood world, presents literally a cartoon, a very primitive little sketch of kind of, sort of, something that is, it's less detailed than the map of Middle Earth that Tolkien did in Lord of the Rings. What's wrong with this picture? Even Narnia has more topography details. And you really got to wonder that these are the people at the top of the food chain. When you look at, there's a thing when we get around to the Cambrian, the meticulous paleogeography charts that are worked up, the things where they're actually noting where the plate boundaries are and where the plate movement directions are, and paleomagnetism data. I mean, it's just, you probably bumped into enough new geology material in the course of just researching all of that thing to realize just how gobsmackingly detailed modern geology is in this area. And then when you move over to creationism, it gets really, 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 really light.
Geologists don't mess around.
Yeah. Oh,
They're
yeah.
pretty serious.
In fact, there's a bunch of them that live in Spokane, and they have these casual get-togethers at local bars where they'll jaw over their latest work and all that kind of stuff. They don't dumb it down.
Oh, heck. I tried, at one point, I asked, actually a couple of points, I asked Stephen Bowman for pointers about some of the stuff because he's a geologist. And he would respond with, like, a paragraph of stuff. And I was like, oh, boy. Yeah, but that's their thing is that it's like lawyers talking lawyerese. That geologists, you sometimes have to kind of drag them in, and that to explain things in layman's terms. And that's why I really love
any geologist that can do that, put on that explain mode to where they're not dumbing any of the technical material down, but they're putting it into terms that become easily accessible for people that haven't kept up on the technical literature. There's a local geologist, I think he's from Central Washington University, that does a bunch of absolutely delicious videos. And they're shown on the local or Idaho public broadcasting and other things. And I've forgotten his name and I've forgotten the damn thing about the channel that he does. But at any rate, they're superlatively done. And you find those a handful of ones, like in the same way that Aaron Ra does systematics analyses, and it can veer all over the place from stuff that pops in from public broadcasting to others. But those are gold mines. John Perry and his plainly speaking stuff. There's another example of things that are put into very, very clear terms. And it's something that you want to tread that balancing act between being technically proficient and accurate and then accessible. And that's why Karis, who cannot be here today, would jump in and say, explain that, put that into plain terms, because don't be ever afraid of asking that kind of question. Because if the person you're asking the question of can't answer it, they don't understand it well enough to be able to answer it. And that can be very, very revealing. So if somebody balks at that, ability to explain things in a straightforward term. Pelagia was picking my brain a little bit ago on the latest video that he did about one of the new Eric Hoving's new creationism tape of the Grand Canyon, and he wanted to know whether or not a parfait was a good analogy to use for rock strata. And I said, yeah, actually, and even better, he couldn't find any visual to go with it. But if you imagine a parfait being formed up layer on layer on layer, that's your Nicholas Steno's superimposition. Then you imagine erosion, and it's like you take a spoon and you're scraping away sections of the parfait, and you might even dig down into quite a few layers before you stop eroding, and then you dump more fresh layers on that fills in the stuff and then builds new layers. That's an unconformity.
I actually was at the Grand Canyon, not last January, but the January before last, and where Eric Hovind was standing, it's this busy area. It's like basically I think that's the South Rim. So
yeah, that's where most of the tourists go.
Yeah, and so you've got all these shops and restaurants and stuff, and he's right there. Actually, I sat right next on the little. He's right next to these little plants, and I sat right there on that bench, and that was where my mom's real mom was. She is an Answers in Genesis person, and so.
Our condolences.
I'm a little snarky punk, and so I looked out over the canyon. I said, "It took a long time for this to form. It took several million years." And she said, "How do you know it didn't happen in the flood?" And I said, "Well, it's not possible to produce this sort of stratification during a flood." And she was like, "Oh, well, all right."
Yeah. I visited the Grand Canyon a couple times, and I've also been to the North Rim, which is up, I think, 1,000 or more feet higher. So it's actually substantially, as you're moving northward, you're starting hitting into Jurassic deposits, and that spills all the way up into all that stuff up in Utah with Zion Canyon and Bryce Canyon and all of that are very, very different geology up in there. But the South Rim, you've got anybody that can look at the Grand Canyon and think, oh, gee whiz, that can form really quick and in a big slosh that goes downstream because it's turning corners. How the hell does that do that? And all the creationists, when they try to do things like that one creationist that did a video, I can't remember who was, I think it was Bill Ludlow, was pillaring him on it, that he takes out a little hose and sprays water into the thing and creates a nice little channel. It's a straight channel, not meandering.
Donald Prothero did that. There was I think it was a British, or it might have been American, but it had a bunch of British young people on it. It was like about conspiracy theories. It was this guy, and he had a couple of young people who were creationists, and he had them meet Jerry Coyne. And
yeah. That was on one of the British TV channels, and I know it's available on YouTube.
And and Prothero had one of the guys take a bucket of water and pour it out, and it just goes straight.
Yeah, you know? This is what happens with there's an example on Mars that some creationists have dithered on, where they say, see, there was a mega flood on Mars, and maybe implying that it was the same time as the flood on Earth. I mean, it's just really wacky. The point is you have a thing where there went back when there was still a lot of fresh water on Mars billions of years ago, that there would be a breach, and you had a catastrophic flooding. Well, what did it do? It cut a wide, narrow, a wide but relatively shallow but extremely wide straight line trench, which is what this happened. That's what happens here where I live with the coulees, that you don't find meanders because water don't do that. The only way that you can do that, I've been having a knee deep in the Messinian salinity crisis that I mentioned last week, and I'm still finishing up the material on that, which is when the Mediterranean Sea pretty much dried up. And it was an interesting test bed because it's doing exactly what the Grand Canyon does in a different context, which is there's a differential between water coming in and water going out. And if the change between one or the other is happening faster than the water can erode, it's going to do an incised canyon. Can't avoid it. It's just hydrodynamics. And in the case of the Grand Canyon, it's because a gigantic uplift has pushed the Colorado Plateau up just about as fast or faster than the water can erode it. Well, in the case of the Mediterranean, it's the water level at the other end dropping. And the whole Mediterranean littered with these little incised canyons, including the Nile, that had a Grand Canyon that was a mile deep at Cairo and still 900 feet deep, 400 miles upstream where the Aswan High Dam was. And the trench itself went even farther back because it was something on the order of 1,200 miles south of Cairo, where there would have been water infill when the Mediterranean Sea refilled up. Jackson has now been kidnapped and has disappeared and will be back momentarily, we hope. Let me look over the. Andy Lord says that was BBC Three in the UK on that show. It was a useful one, although I was kind of disappointed with them bringing Jerry Coyne in because he was the guy that was to discuss the flood and the Bible. He's not a Bible expert. He's not a geologist. He was actually the wrong person to have brought on for that particular topic.
Yeah.
He needed somebody that was more knowledgeable on it.
Had they discussed macroevolution, he could have done he's written like textbooks on that.
Oh gosh, speciation. He's a huge textbook on that. But so bring him in on speciation. Don't bring him in on Bible chronology. I mean, this is just the wrong little bit. So he was at a disadvantage from that point. And that's another point about why you want to deploy the best information and the best material. Now we're starting to get into a little bit better period because not only writing on this book, but on further works that we shall be doing in due course that we shall not discuss. At any rate, anyway, the thing is that an awful lot of the primary source scholarship on the history of the mythology of the Bible and its connections with Egypt and its connection with the Babylonians and the various Mesopotamian flood stories and all this other stuff. There's an awful lot more that is becoming accessible in the primary journals and in various books that have been written to where you don't have to bust a gut and buy a crap to be able to get this material to make use of. And the science material, of course, we are in like golden age when it comes to the accessibility of the science stuff. But that biblical journals and the back and forths that you can get into in the various works on the epigraphy and inscriptions and all the other stuff that goes on in the textual scholarship, a lot of that was in fairly obscure journals that was not as accessible then as now. So it's getting just better and better and better, which means the more people out there, gang, who learn source methods and get used to how to use Google tools to get primary source material and skip past the Wikipedia level and the secondary blog level to get at primary source stuff. If you're going to be an activist, means that you can marshal in a network a colossal amount of information, which means there can be a whole string of anvils on every imaginable subject that you can just be deploying the right one and position it. Come over, a little bit over. There we go. like a Warner Brothers cartoon. We want to be the Roadrunner, not Wile E. Coyote. And the creationists may try to paint fake caves onto the wall or tunnels onto the thing, but nope, we're going to slip right through them because we'll have the data. And there's no excuse in 2019 not to be able to do that. We've shown in our own work, in the work that I've done in Evolution Slam Dunk, shameless plug, whoops. Let me There's a link to Evolution Slam Dunk in the thing. If you don't have it, please get it. It's the book on the reptile mammal transition. I wrote it because nobody else had done this before. So you'll be armed to the teeth with full blown macroevolution. And apropos our upcoming subject, you might as well, get Irwin and Valentine's The Cambrian Explosion. It's an excellent introductory work. It's only a few years old. It's really beautifully illustrated, and it's an excellent work to describe that pivotal little Cambrian explosion thing, which is an area that is routinely mangled by anti-evolutionists. This one is yes, you have your copy as well. It's a very important area because the Cambrian explosion gets mangled. Phyla. Oh, yes, that wonderful book by Valentine, which even though it was written 15 years ago, is still just gobsmackingly
I'm nearly
meticulous.
done. I'm actually about to get to the part where he starts talking about the Cambrian explosion. So,
Yeah, that's the fun part because in many ways, all the interesting stuff is happening before the explosion. That you're trying to think out. T.D. Lang says, I can only get so many books, RJ. Well, get mine first, and then and then the others. But I would put that on your wish list because there's an awful lot of really wonderful works. It's written by professionals who are noted in their field, but yet it's not written in a dry manner. The Cambrian Explosion book is beautifully illustrated, and it's got just a wondrous updating. There's stuff on the genetics and all of that, and that brings us to the mid part. We're about halfway through, so let me go do my shameless plug. We won't be putting the image up on it, but I want to thank everybody for who's done helped out. RJ's tip patrons. We've got our colleagues Hendril and Eric and Suris, and our researchers Travis and Convert and Eat Meal and Ralph and Pelagia. Hi, Pelagia. And Benjamin Simpson and Ugly German Truths, and our assistant researchers, Mike Apple and Duranko and James and Todes Trial, and our friends Daniel and Stephen Bauman, and Marigale Beddoes and Insects Are Cool, and Morton Nielsen and Puffalophagus, who is in the chat, and Bo and Staggles and Alex and Paul Williams, and also legacy patrons who were able to help at one point, but under various circumstances weren't able to keep up at it. I still am very grateful for every buck. Every bit that has been donated in one form or another. Jen and Jody and John and Keith and Andrew and Dyer and Yui and Mona and Brad and Daniel and Nana and Sun Sky Stone and Everett and Tsur and Zeshi. Every one of you, I have appreciate all the help you go to help out, because as somebody on Social Security who's getting a little trickle of book royalties and the Patreon and the GoFundMe, which I put links in on each video, it matters. It's a difference between being able to make the bills easily or having to triage back over. And now that winter's coming up, I got to figure out and make sure keep temperatures down so I don't use up fuel before I can reach. All those things happen. Anyway, meanwhile, I keep at all the work. And Jackson and I are writing together a book, The Rocks Were There, which I'm very proud of Evolution Slam Dunk. I'm even prouder of what we're doing in Rocks Were There. This is kick butt. The range of material, partly because Slam Dunk dealt with some creationists, but not per se about the chronology aspect. I just alluded to it. But because we're dealing with the Answers in Genesis Answers books across the whole range, the sciencey ones, they trample almost everything. And so there's such a range of material that needs to be covering, from how stars make elements to why beachfronts look the way they do, and what estuaries are like, and what radiometric dating works like, and why systematics works, and why creationist baraminology doesn't, and all of this stuff. It's such an immense range, and we've wanted to keep it really, really up to date. Each one of us annoys the other by saying, "Ooh, new paper that's just come up. Can we work this in?" Which we do. So when it comes out, hopefully by the end of the year, in
just
time for
yesterday.
Christmas. Yeah, literally just yesterday. And I just put in a new thing just today on a revision that I'd come up with. I thought, I just discovered that Rupi and Sanford had shot their mouth off on that diamond matter. So whoop, in it goes. So it means that anybody that comes at a young Earth creationist you'll know their arguments a million times better than they will. And you'll know the data that they have attempted to marshal for their case. And you'll know why they mangled and manipulated and claptrapped it up so much. And you'll have the doors open on all that vast science field that they don't pay any attention to whatsoever. It's so exhilarating. Both of us learn things in the course of researching the book that we didn't know about before. It's been a delight. And we both have a certain writing style that I think meshes fairly well with each other. And then, so it makes it an easy collaboration to work with on it. And the fact is, both of us just really are terribly curious, and we like it to be right. We don't want to just make the thing. We're not going to go for the cheap shot thing, although there's plenty of opportunities for it. And well, we earn our cheap shots, Jackson, because when some of the ones like Riddle and Menton and Georgia Purdom, I mean, they deserve what we dump on them, because in the case of Purdom in particular, good gravy, she should know better. Snelling should know better. These are people that are aware of the data field, and for them to be making the manipulations that they do as blatantly as they do, you really got to wonder about it. Lisa says, why ECs are allergic to learning? Well, it's that Tortugan mind shell. They got the thick mind shell. They have the object of desire. They're hunkered down, and you can just think Mitch McConnell just pulled in. And information that conflicts with the worldview just bounces off. It deflects. And you can see this at all levels. Nobody can accuse Andrew Snelling of not being a knowledgeable person. Nobody could accuse Kurt Wise of not being a knowledgeable person. But yet, when they put on their little creationism hat, they start turning into Clem Cadiddlehopper. That's the old character from Red Skelton there. You know, it was the typical hick. There, you go, what happens to their brain here? The times when I guess he's was he a dentist? David Menton, is he a dentist or a medical doctor?
He's a cell biologist.
Cell biologist. Hard to tell from his writing, though, isn't it? I mean, the degree to which he plays off of stuff, and if there's one motto that we could have for this whole book is, the creationist just cited a technical paper. And we just get these just smiles on our face, because now you can track back to primary source, just like I've been doing with all this other stuff. TD Lane says, so what's this about Mesozoic turtles in Congress? Yes, indeed. I'm afraid that that there are an awful lot of Tortugans. There's one as president of the United States. There's one now as head of Brazil. You've got an awful lot of Tortugans running around. I think the ample indication is, however cute they may be in terrariums and in that environment, as leaders of countries, they're really a bad idea. And you should probably avoid all of that. And the very same, those of you who follow me on Twitter will know, I've taken to following the President of the United States now, and I'm making comments to him as well. I figure, heck, things are coming to a head, and we got to deal with these things. And I also joust with people on religion issues, and I also joust with people on science issues, and often they're the same people. But the point is, I'm using exactly the same method every single time, which is, I have reasons why I believe what I do, and I'm perfectly willing to explain them. I love it when somebody makes the terrible mistake of saying, do you have evidence for that? Oh, now that you ask. And I'll do that as well. You'll notice I behave exactly the same way with people on here. The one I have decided to block is dear C. Brown, the little creationist. I see he hasn't put up hasn't tried to put any comments in. And I told him the last time that he made a comment when he was lambasting on this diamond matter, that you need to contact the scientists and you need to tell them why you think cosmic rays can't possibly produce any new carbon-14 in a diamond, and tell us about that. And until you do, no more comments. And he's just dropped off the scope on that. So he tried to put up a few little comments, his usual shtick, and I would just junk them. So that's the one area I normally don't like banning anybody from a field, but he needs to have the equivalent of the teacher in the old Catholic school with the ruler going dum, when they've done something wrong. Is that you need to up your game, and if you're wanting to discuss science matters, then don't shy away from talking about the scientists.
I've got not C. Brown, but I can't remember his name. He's an idiot. S. global. I think it's supposed to be global, but it's global.
Mm.
He drops something irrelevant or stupid or both on like every video I put up now. On the DNA replication one, he said, well, where does the information come from? And I said, define information. And he said, well, I can't really do that. And I said, thanks for admitting it doesn't exist. So,
Yeah, it's meaningless.
yeah.
And here is one of the fundamental divides between anti-evolutionists and normal people, is on this whole issue of what direction they look at. I've used the phrase origins or bust a lot. Everybody that's on Twitter will see me make use of it. It has any of those areas where explain why this is. And the thing they want you to explain is really fundamental. Like, well, how did life originate? Why is there matter? When did the universe begin? These are the basics of things. And what this is a dodge. When they're talking about why information and how the DNA code worked out, it's still an unknown. We don't have all the details of it. There's ongoing research, and it's really, 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 really hard to figure out. But that is it's like a laser pointer that keeps their brain away from thinking about everything else. And it's no coincidence that the reason why Darwin and Wallace independently came up with their model and independently created such a revolution in biology, like overnight, is because they're looking at what they can see now and going, okay, how did that come about? And what happened before that? And what was before that? And what was before that? And the last 150 years has filled in more and more and more and more and more of those that's and that's and that's and that's and that's, to where it's fair to say that almost everything from the last 500 million years on is kind of like, oh, kind of settled. And so it's now that period in the 500 million years before that that's the really interesting part, which brings us back around, segue time, to this little matter of the evolution news and views posting.
I do have to say, though, the period from, I think it's 1.8 billion to 1.8 billion years to 800 million years ago is titled the boring billion. So
yeah, which and for all the wrong
thanks,
reasons and right reasons, because what was going on in there was taking place in the critters that eventually became the basis of metazoans. And masses of genetic things are going on in those bacteria and protozoa. And we don't have any fossil record of it. It's physically impossible for that stuff to be preserved. Even if you had a little squiggly thing in a rock, you can't tell what's going on inside of its cells, what kind of cis regulators it is. You're completely sunk. So all of the work that's been done on that, and it's mounting and mounting, has to be done by paleogenomic retrocalculation, to work back, to peel back layer on layer on layer with every possible version of existing organisms, particularly ones that on phylogenetic grounds are very deep rooted in the family tree, to try to surmise what was going on in the things that were going on back then during that air quotes boring billion. And I bet you, no, this is not boring. This is the windup for the genetic systems of the development of HOX genes and a whole slew of things that are eventually going to start flowering in these later organisms, of which we cannot assume that all the lineages that played important parts are currently around. That there could have been ones that were engaging in some really busy little endosymbiotic processes, but their lineages that were independent of that have gone extinct since. That's probably true for the ancestor of the mitochondria, whereas the cyanobacteria are literally the group from which chloroplasts developed. The mitochondrial group may be a bunch that's now extinct. We only have their cousins. So that makes it much harder to work out a little fiddly bit deal. Lisa for Truth says, word too long for YECs. Oh, yes, there are so many words that are too long for younger creationists.
I'm sure that during the boring billion, the choanoflagellates didn't find it very boring.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And choanoflagellates, let me type that into the thing over in here. Choanoflagellates. I think I'm getting the spelling it right.
CHOANOFLAGELATES.
Choanoflagellates. I think that's it. They are a really interesting bunch because an awful lot of the genetic systems that we metazoans are using are derived from the kinds of things that were being developed in the choanoflagellates. So you can find some of the technical literature.
And before. Receptor tyrosine kinases, integrins, cadherins, these things actually go back as far back as, because you have choanoflagellates, which are the sister of metazoa, then you have philisterians, you find most of the same elements in them. as with the ichthyosporians, and even further back, go back past our common ancestor with fungi to the apusozoans, things like Amastigomonas. You're still finding these early elements that would later become incorporated in
You see
multicellularity.
why I love working with you, Jackson? That you can rattle that off. I would have to write all that stuff out, and you have got it internalized in your head because you're into biology as your budding profession. So you've got a connection to that in the same way that I can rattle off some of the things in relation to some of the history and some of the paleontology matters, because we love it and we love learning about it all. Anyway, the neat thing about this paper, which I would have loved to have put up as a direct link, but it isn't open access yet. But I did put up Evolution News and Views. And they did a recent posting on this that I felt was too stupid not to call attention to. And if you read through it, go to the link and follow it through, there's nothing there. It's just a set of authority quotes and snarks at summaries saying, oh, those evolutionists, they're trying to explain this with their song and dance. And then there's some quotes where they're talking about it. And then here's some things where they're saying maybe and possibly. See, they're using those little wiggle words. It's the same shtick you get from younger creationists in their context. What you don't get is their model. What does the intelligent designer think happened? What were they? Why were there Claudina? These cute little things that got little tubes that start out in the Precambrian and then they extend into just the early Cambrian and then they go extinct. What about small shelly fauna? What about all these other? This particular paper has a whole line, and my God, the print's small, where they talk about in the Precambrian thing, Carnia and Rangia and Swartpuntia and Emietta and Pteridinium and Dickinsonia. That's the big floor mat thing. And Kimberella and Hyutia and Thaumaptilon, which may or may not be related to sea pins and things like that. And Stromatovarus. Most of these taxa literally were unknown even 10 or 15 years ago. And so you've got a matter of where they're trying to fill in the blips on the scope. What this paper was doing is trying to get around a serious difficulty that we have, and that is that the ancestors of all those cute little Cambrian critters are tiny, small-bodied ones that have virtually no chance of getting fossilized unless you've got a Lagerstätten deposit, and we don't have those. So all they've got are these blurry little examples of the critters. They can tell a lot about the environment, and that was another important thing where they're trying to end run around it, which is to work out the ecosystems that are involved, where they're living, what the sea balance was, temperature gradients. They can work out an amazing amount by going interdisciplinary and bringing in things from the paleoecologists and the geologists and the radioisotope people and all these other things to put together a map of it, to get a sense about the revolutions that were going on. And it's starting to look like the Cambrian, in a way, wasn't as big a thing in terms of the change in the dynamic of what was going on. What's much more jump in.
Oh, I was agreeing with you. I mean, a number of those a number of those organisms that you mentioned have been relatively positively identified as animals, as metazoans, whether stem probably in a number of them. Camberella is likely a Lophotrochozoan. It's at least a bilaterian. Metaspergina might be a trilobitomorph. Dickinsonia is some sort of bilaterian based on its ontogeny.
And apparently moved.
Yeah.
Apparently they found tracks of them. That means it has some kind of muscle things to be able to go. We have nothing that's alive today. One of the little questions, if I can ever have a debate with somebody on the Cambrian explosion, which has not happened yet. And speaking of which, I haven't had a debate in quite a long time. Is everybody afraid of me? I don't know. They do all these.
I haven't had many either, RJ. So it's it's what it is.
Darn! It's almost like they don't like to talk with us.
I had one. I talked to Long Story Short about this very topic. I haven't heard from him back recently, so I don't know if
he seemed all anxious to have a further follow through, but yet that dwindled.
Yeah,
because it might dawn on him that he really needs to do a hell of a lot more homework before he can come in and play on the big kids field.
It might be, I know school and work take up most of my time, and so he might have a family or something. I have no idea.
Oh, indeed. People have life. I'm a retiree, so I have the advantage of being able to actually tunnel vision focus on all this stuff, but I can easily understand that aspect as well. Yeah. But there's also the indication that when you listen to his discussion of things, he doesn't really know much beyond just the talking points he copied from intelligent designers.
Oh no, and I mean the both of the both of the major arguments of, because he's relying in large part on Stephen Meyer's book Darwin's
Yeah.
Doubt. Both of the major arguments are dead wrong, which is that A, there are no precursors of the Cambrian organisms, they just kind of pop up out of nowhere, and B, that there is no mechanism to generate the diversity of Cambrian forms. Both of these arguments are just dead wrong across the board.
Yeah. Oh, Andy, here's the perfect thing. They can't handle the RJ Wheat Dream Team. Yeah, that's what we should have there. You know, we should be the double whammy thing that says, yeah, dare to take on RJ and Jackson simultaneously.
The last one we did together was with Nephilim Free, for God's sakes. That was a complete waste of time. I don't even know why we
everything
agreed to
Nephilim
that.
does is a waste of time.
I don't even know why we agreed to that.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
anyway, the neat thing then about this issue about what's going on in the Precambrian part, for me, the most intriguing thing is the missing stuff. Is that we know there's a predator-prey system that's developing in that Precambrian period that's becoming more and more significant. There are metazoans of unknown form because they're not fossilized, but they have their tracks that are burrowing, that are disturbing the soil. There's a whole ecosystem there that's functionally invisible because we don't have any Lagerstätten deposits. So what this paper is trying to do is lay out the benchmarks of the trophic systems and how they're changing over time to put in benchmarks then that future scientists then are going to be able to come in and to go, what needed to have been going on to account for all of this stuff? And eventually the paleogenomics people are going to reach the stage, whether it's in the next 5, 10, or maybe 20 or 30 years, but eventually are going to be able to work back farther and farther and farther to figure out what early chordates were looking like before we get the ones that we see in the Cambrian, which already are very, very, very primitive. That's another little thing. I wanted to use the let's visit the Cambrian beach thing in a debate to where you say, oh gosh, how many people in the audience know about the Cambrian? And I bet not many people raise their hands. So you say, ooh, well, let's imagine we're on a beach. And there's a river coming down from some mountains behind us, and there's maybe a volcano going burp burp out in the middle of the bay. Describe what kind of life we're seeing, and you turn to the anti-evolutionists and okay, wing it, because I don't think a lot of them have the foggiest idea of what was alive then. They've got just buzzwords of the phyla were there. Well, what does that mean?
Which phyla?
What was alive? Yeah.
Not even all the phyla were there, actually. So.
And ironically, the only people who can say that the animal phyla were present in the Cambrian are evolutionists, because you only have a chunk of them that you can physically trace back by actual fossils, and some of them, like the chelicerates, are evolutionary ancestors that they don't even have the chelicerae yet. They're the precursor models. And so nobody in a straight face should be able to say that unless they're an evolutionist. But yet, another question that I've used a little bit online, and you get crickets instantly. Do they believe that anything alive today is physically descended from what was alive in the Cambrian? And that means they would have to apply their understanding of intelligent design systematics, that's an oxymoron, to actually fill in stuff. So it's not good enough to say what isn't related to things is anything related to anything. And they don't have a model on that. Immutable Destiny says, any new studies regarding the origin of life that try to explain the diversity and functionality of ribozymes, as they're thought to be a potential way that reactions could be catalyzed? Short answer is yep. The fact that the core of a ribozyme is an RNA molecule, or the ribosome is an RNA molecule, and that ribozymes are RNA that are capable of catalyzing themselves and autocatalytic behavior, and they can also do a little bit of self-replication. When we were having a discussion with the person that shall not be named, but has been that we did not online, he was thinking in those same terms, that you're going to be seeing in the next few years more and more people pondering what is going on underneath that layer cake of ribosome proteins.
I'm inclined to think there was something pre-RNA.
Yeah, and one of the major things, and he also was open to this as a very likely possibility, that DNA is a parasite, that it's a thing that came along after this replicator system that makes use of RNA. And the other puzzlement is why are particular nucleotides associated with particular amino acids. And that's still a murky area that involves essentially replicating this autocatalytic systems that are going on. The one thing that also I found that he would agreed on that I think is a really good benchmark is replication occurs after metabolism. That you have to have metabolism first. You have to have a series of completely automatic, non-living things that are generating molecules and doing stuff in busy little ways that are
Well,
life-ish, in the same way viruses are life-ish.
well,
And then the replicators come in. Because if a jump
sorry.
in.
No,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's no surprise that the acetyl-CoA metabolism shares a lot in common with the normal chemical reactions that are going on at alkaline hydrothermal vents. Are practically the exact same. So,
Old Scratch says it was recent research about how ribosomes weren't needed. Yes, that's another thing, is that they've found a way that amino acids can be plugged together without using a ribosome. And so that's another indication of how little blobs of reactive stuff that do stuff on their own automatically could be occurring in a variety of contexts. The one thing, and also the person that we were talking with agreed functionally, that you have got millions of years of stuff going on before you hit Luca. That the origin of life aspect, and it could be even 100 million years. There's more than enough time from the time the late heavy bombardment stopped to the time when you start seeing the first traces of life, where we know it's by 3.8 billion. There's certain isotopic evidence that's very suggestive that it's probably closer to 4 billion, might even be a little bit earlier, but you still got 100 million years or more. That's a long time that's going on. Oh, in fact, another little thing about this this paper from Rachel Wood that is alluded to in the Discovery Institute thing is the chronology range. When they're looking about the role from macroalgae on, and the area that they're gradually showing in increasing, get that a little closer to the camera there, an increasing mass of complex organisms. The range is from roughly 580 million years to 500 million. That's 80 million years of stuff going on. That's longer than the time that we are from T-Rex. That's a lot of stuff going on. All you have to think about is all the things that happened after the dinosaurs checked out in evolution to realize how much can go on in 70 or 80 million years, even in 5 or 10 million years. 10 million years, you are back before the first Australopithecines. 10 million years is about the time frame that all whale evolution, the major elements of whale evolution, are taking place within a window like that. So that's a long time. And whenever these creationists start coming out, oh, this stuff appeared just suddenly. No, not quite. So it's I don't shy away from any of that stuff. I love to talk about that in the Ediacara biota. That's the thing, Ediacara biota. Notice I said biota and not fauna, because it's still not at all sure whether some of those things are animals, and whether even our definition of animal kind of breaks down when we're dealing with some of these weird little frondy things.
they might be protists.
Yeah. Well, and the big debate on some of the things. The area where it's still super cutting edge are ones that are trying to figure out if they can generate some of those forms by variants on homeobox genes. Because if they are likely to have homeobox genes, that drags them over into that animal thing. Then the other area that's still way we don't even know the right questions to ask yet, is proto-HOX. What genetic systems are the things that led to the HOX gene system and also para-HOX genes? Those are their little cousins. They're still just fiddling around with it. But remember, the HOX genes were only first found in the 1990s. I mean, it's that video recorders are older.
Jackson was also found in the 1990s. I said Jackson was also found in the 1990s.
Yes, well, there you go. See, it's all connected, man. It's all connected.
It's all connected.
Pavlov asks, could that DNA parasite hypothesis be why humans seem to have a built-in fear that a new organism that is foreign to Earth will come and wipe all the previous life forms out? No, that's just paranoia. It's a long-standing. Well, I won't say long-standing. It's a trope that occurred once it dawned on people that there might be things off the Earth. So probably the benchmark here, I'm suddenly going to go geek on you, would be War of the Worlds with the invading organisms there, and that's 1899. So you're in the late 19th century at that point. Once you start playing around with that and figuring out what all you can do, if you want to have a delicious example of a thing that's a really neat one, plus it's remarkably scientifically and politically interesting, is Robert Wise's 1970 movie, The Andromeda Strain. Good Lord, I love that film. And it was really badly remade fairly recently. There was an Australian version of it where they involved time travel and a whole bunch of other stuff that wasn't in the original story. But catch out the original one, The Andromeda Strain.
I think that, if there are aliens, people probably shouldn't worry about alien viruses taking over or anything, because the odds that some aliens have DNA are almost nil. So,
or even DNA. That's another fascinating issue is if there can be other forms of life, how are they structured? And how much are they like what we're used to? That goes straight back to your Simon Conway Morris style issues about how much convergence happens, how much is inevitable, is the hand of providence guiding the organisms through to become Homo sapiens, the pinnacle of everything. The beautiful example, this shows you how far back it was going, right around that same period, early 1900s. It wasn't published during his lifetime, but it was available now. Good old Mark Twain. And he, in fact, was responding, good God, I'm trying to think of the guy he was making. Yes, Alfred Wallace. Wallace had just written a book about the providential mind that was responsible for the origin of life and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And the intelligent designers have tried to co-opt him, because he was still a natural selection evolutionist. But the thing is that the snarky mind of Mark Twain couldn't resist writing a commentary on it. And he didn't publish it during his lifetime. But the thing was, he used the analogy of the Eiffel Tower. And he thought, oh, yes, the sliver of paint on the top of the Eiffel Tower thinks that the tower underneath it was designed to hold it up.
I mean, it's not wrong. I can't follow that line of reasoning, because you're talking about 13.8 billion years, and in the last half a second of Earth's history, that's what we came here for. That's
Immutable Destiny. Mutable Destiny has got a really good question on there, to which I will be able to say I have not a clue to the answer. A good question regarding life is, why don't more organisms try the virus route and store their DNA in a capsid and just use molecular needles? That's a very good question.
Maybe they did originally.
Maybe they did originally. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that there's downsides to that. That there are things that, one of the things that you've seen, the pre-sexually reproducing organisms have a sea of DNA exchange. They lateral gene transfer rampantly. And this keeps them busily moving past their potential predators and also parasites. When you get to be a sexually or more complex metazoan, you now have the problem of parasites that can gum up your works. And it turns out sex is a really effective way to counteract that. And so it's probable or possible that it may be that you can make organisms that derive in that capsid mode, but that they will have a downside. And that they may have existed in that billions of years earlier, but then they just fizzled out because they got outcompeted, in the same way that so many of, virtually every organism on the planet eventually gets outcompeted. And so you can have a good trick that runs for a while maybe 100 million years, but over billions of years, the luck runs out.
There are a couple of, Nick Lane is one of them. There are a couple of researchers who posit that sex arose adaptively to counteract the effects of mitochondria, because following the endosymbiosis of mitochondria, it was putting off like catalases and
and remember, the little, like even to this day, the mitochondria have their little mitts on our cell death systems
Yeah,
and all that. Boy, they're
apoptosis, yeah. And so the
yeah, we
idea
can't live
is,
with them. We can't live without them.
yeah, so the idea is that it was that recombination that meiosis worked to basically fix DNA, and so
Yeah.
perhaps sex evolved as a layering on top of that. So
The one thing that in that question that Destiny brought up, it's that the cutting edge work that's being done on Origin of Life involves trying to work out outside of the box of what we're used to with existing chemistry. And the idea that there can be things that were going on that went somewhere, but yet no longer are playing a role in existing organisms. That's the hardest thing to deal with, because trying to retro engineer the existing organism can get you kind of back to Luca. But that training wheel period is still very speculative. And so the only way you can do it is bottom up, by experimenting with hydrothermal vents and catalytic things and PNAs as well as RNAs and various other ways of interacting stuff and playing around with the things. There's a relatively small number of people doing that research. I would contend that more people are trying to work out drugs to help people with obesity than are working on all of the Origin of Life research anywhere. So the idea that, there's like, I imagine some creationists think that there's all this vast amount of money that's being poured into the scientific. No, that's not true. That it's kind of done by grant that's sort of on the side of stuff, because it's very, very speculative and interesting. In the same way, trying to contact alien life through radio signals is a thing that governments don't pay attention to. It's probably a waste of time.
they'll
But
be
if some
getting
moneybags,
our SS and Hitler speeches.
yeah. Oh,
Right.
I still love the movie Contact, and it's got one of the neatest sound effects of modern science fiction film. The sound the signal makes is just delicious. I'm very pleased with the movie all the way around. Good cast. It still holds up really well for having been made like a quarter of a century ago. Good heavens, how time flies, and how
Really?
time flies on our little show here.
Jeez
We
Louise.
zipped through an hour on that. Yes, Vesta remembers the Andromeda strain when computer overloaded the error code 601 appeared. It's also got an all electronic film score, which is really kind of funky, that you don't hear these days. It's not pretending to be a conventional orchestra. And so I can still remember the ning, 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 ning sound in that. So there, that goes off on that. Puff asked, do brain cells contain mitochondria? I only asked because your brain requires glucose for fuel. I'm not sure. I think all of our cells have mitochondria.
Yeah.
And in fact, lots of them. So there's not just like a single branch.
The only
so
ones
I would
think that don't. Yeah, I think the only ones that like don't have nuclei or whatever are the was it the red blood cells? Something like that.
Yes, well, all the cells that don't have mitochondria, they don't get invited to any of the parties. So there it is.
Sad
It's
day.
just all that. Yeah, it's just sad. There's a lot of cliquiness going on in our biochemistry, man. We're not.
Actually, sperm don't have mitochondria. There you go.
Well, that explains why they're so pesky.
Yeah, they're too small. They're actually too small. There is a relatively, which is what you get your mitochondria matrilineally. There are rare instances where you have this really thing that sounds extremely gross. It's called paternal leakage, where you can transmit mitochondria
very
to your
rare.
father.
If you Google that, if you dare, and if you don't find a porn site, there will actually be some technical papers on it. But yeah, it's very unusual in vertebrates to do that. But once in a while, those pesky little paternal mitochondria will butt in, when normally the matrial female version is the one that overrides almost always. But and it's not yet known whether there's been any interesting evolutionary effects of all of that. It's all those little tiny little niches off in the corner of the exceptions too. That's another area where I do a lot of data collecting, is on the error correction systems in DNA. This to me is an origins question. There's a whole bunch of stuff that comes into play if the wrong amino acid is put in incorrectly, or if they've glitched up on things. There's apparently the whole process of making a protein, which occurs very fast, can kind of snag, and there's kind of moments where it sort of zitches up, and there are things designed to compensate that and to nudge it forward. And then there's a cleanup crew for the mess that gets produced that isn't used. And all of those things, to my mind, are origins issues. it's unlikely that those were in play in the beginning of life, but how did they come about? And they must have evolved by that means. So that, to my mind, is just as fascinating a question as to why we use A, T, C, and G as nucleotides. So anyway, that leaves people with a bunch of questions on there. A useless information, the Andromeda strain record was 6-sided. Well, there we go. Anyway, it's a movie that I highly recommend. If you can get it in Blu-ray, that's the best version because it's a beautiful print on that. Robert Wise, who had done The Day the Earth Stood Still, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Sound of Music, a wide, varied career. Yeah, it's one of my favorite science fictions, and in fact, one of the few movies I ever went to see more than once at the drive-in because I really loved it. It's intricately done, beautiful cast, sharp wit, things about. It was taking place in the Nixon years, so you had the whole bit about
Star Wars, woo!
This was 7 years before Star Wars. Yeah, this was quite a few years before that, and it didn't do ridiculously well at the box office. But I think wears very well over time, and for a film that's made almost 50 years ago, is well worth viewing. Well, we've slipped past our thing here. Thank you all for showing up for another Evolution Hour. If you haven't got Evolution Slam Dunk, get it. If you like good fiction, or even if you like semi-mediocre fiction, no, actually, I think I've written a very nice book, Paralogs of Phileas Fogg, and I'm working on the sequel to that too. There's places to donate to become a Patreon of the site. There's places to go to GoFundMe, and also Puff's GoFundMe that he's doing for funeral expenses for a friend. Pay attention to that too. And there we go. We'll be back another week. We're continuing the fight the good fight, and there's more than enough woo out there to fight, so we're going to keep at it as long as we bloody well can. So that ends us.
That cuts this. Okay. Bye, everybody.